Welcome to ACC Nation. I'm Jim Quist. That's Will Ogenin. And our special guest is the publisher of CardinalSports, Ty Spalding. Welcome, Ty.
Welcome, guys. Thanks for having me on. Look forward to diving into some Louisville sports here with you all and giving you all an inside look on what's going on down in Kentucky.
Sounds good. Hey, there is lots to talk about when it comes down to the Cardinals. Comment on Reddit. Louisville women's basketball is hot. We're going to touch on that. There's an interesting rumor that Tom Jurich would entertain returning to Louisville. That's an interesting conversation. We'll talk a little bit about that. What's going on with Scott Satterfield and Louisville football? Ty will answer some of those questions. But first, let's jump into basketball and the dismissal of Chris Mack. Ty, outside of Louisville, this caught some people by surprise, but I got the impression that within the Louisville circle, it really was an expected move. And some thoughts from you on Chris Mack's time with the program and what led to his departure.
Yeah, so, a lot of the national folks, the ESPN broadcast for the Duke game on Saturday have referred to the Chris Mack separation as a firing or a dismissal. And, that's honestly really, really not the case here. It actually, talking with some people that I can pretty much say that Chris Mack initiated these conversations on his own. There was a couple weeks where you could just tell in his body language on the sideline that he just looked defeated. He didn't know what to do. Some post-game press conferences, some head-scratching quotes came from him and some of the captains on the team. So this was building up. And then Louisville hosted Notre Dame where they retired Russ Smith's jersey. And Rick Pitino came on the Jumbotron for a message, and the crowd went berserk, loudest cheer of the season up until that point. And then after Louisville collapsed in the second half, Chris Mack got booed off the floor. So putting the timeline together, that's kind of the tipping point in all of this when those discussions between Mack's camp and Louisville heated up. But for all intents and purposes, this was a mutual separation, a mutual parting of ways, and I think it was a win-win for both parties.
Well, it sounds a little on the painful side, to be quite frank, the way that you've laid it out there. That is not the most ideal way for somebody to depart. But again, as you noted, if this is something that in his world, in his mind, that things were not going the right way, and he had to make a decision. I guess it turned out for the best for both sides. Where do we stand from the standpoint of looking for a new coach?
Yeah, so like you said, obviously someone losing their job isn't a win-win, but Mack just looked miserable. Like he just looked like he wasn't having fun anymore. He looked like this was spilling over into his personal life. So from that standpoint, that's why I say it's a win-win. And Louisville won in a sense that it didn't have to pay Chris Mack his full $12 million buyout. Louisville saved around $8 million in this whole deal here. So that was a really, really good angle that Louisville can take away from this, is that they saved a bunch of money by reaching an agreement mid-season. Moving forward, there's an interim in place, obviously, the rest of the way. Mike Pegues, who's been with Chris Mack for 10-plus years. The players respect him. He served as the head coach for the first 6 games of the year when Mack was suspended. So he's leading the team moving forward. But there's a couple of candidates that I would say Louisville zeroed in on, and one in particular, and that being longtime Kentucky assistant and former Louisville player Kenny Payne. Kenny Payne is now with the Knicks. He has never been a head coach before, but there's a strong push from a lot of influential people here in the city that are really making a push for Kenny Payne. A lot of the former players are voicing their support for Kenny Payne, and all roads at this point are leading back to Kenny Payne being the next head coach at the University of Louisville.
So let's get into some of the reasons that it didn't work out. I think one of the things, just as an outsider, that it just felt like development was an issue for the staff. And I look at guys like Samuel Williamson, who came in as a McDonald's All-American, and I think it's fair to say he has kind of regressed this season. This team has not been a very good three-point shooting team this year. And you get a guy like Matt Cross, who came over from Miami, was a 40% three-point shooter as a freshman last year. Now he's shooting above or less than 30% from three. Why did this staff struggle to develop some of these players?
That's when you list out the reasons of what Chris Mack failed in or why it failed here. Player development is at the top of the list or near the top of the list. He brought in a 6-man recruiting class in 2019. 3 of those players have transferred to mid-major programs. Josh Nickelberry transferred to LaSalle, Quinn Slazinski transferred to Iona, and Aiden Agahan transferred to Grand Canyon. Then you have David Johnson, who was probably going to be a first-round pick, and he actually regressed a little bit in his time at Louisville, and now he's playing in the G League. And then on the current roster from that class, you have Samuel Williamson and Jalen Withers, and both of those guys, like you said, have not gotten any better over the 3 years that they've been here. So is it talent evaluation? That's kind of a thing that I go back to. Did Chris Mack and his staff misevaluate these recruits when they were in high school? That's certainly possible, but I do think that there's a case to be made that there's not one player you can point to that's played under Chris Mack that has developed in his system and really been a guy that has thrived and gotten better over the course of his career. There's really not one guy that stands out that you can point to and be like, Chris Mack developed this guy. So going back to your point, that's really been a big cause for the lack of success for Chris Mack here at Louisville. And like you said, the 2 guys that Louisville was counting on this year, Samuel Williamson and Jalen Withers, neither of those guys are really giving Louisville much at all.
So let's get into the on-the-court stuff. It came out a little bit ago before we started recording that Malik Williams is going to be suspended for the North Carolina game. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so word started to get around this afternoon that the Louisville locker room had really gone off the rails. There was some turmoil within the locker room back when Chris Mack was still the coach. Many people chalked that up to Chris Mack and the players not liking Mack, but it turns out that may not be the case completely. So Malik Williams, a 6-year guy, a captain on this team, he apparently got into a argument, a disagreement with interim head coach Mike Pegues. Mike Pegues said tonight on his coach's show that Williams, quote, fought coaching and fought criticism. And that for right now it's a 1-game suspension, but the term that they're using is suspended indefinitely. So Louisville will be without him tomorrow night, and they will be without Roosevelt Wheeler, another guy on the front line. He's out with a concussion. So Louisville will be very, very thin up front tomorrow against a big UNC team.
That's going to be tough. As we know, Armando Bacot is a really good player, and that's going to be a tall task for this team. But this is team in its past 2 games, they have gotten off to really short, rough starts. They were down 27-8 to Virginia and 24-8 to Duke. Now they did come back and were competitive in both of those games. But what's been behind the slow starts in these past 2 games?
So I think each of those games, there's a different reasoning. The Virginia game, that was the last game that Chris Mack coached at Louisville, and he just looked checked out on the sidelines. He had his hand, his face in his hands. He was on a knee, and I just don't think he really gave his full attention to that game plan, to that prep, to that scout, and the play on the floor reflected that. As far as the Duke game, that was the biggest crowd that the Yum Centers had in over 2 years. That place was full. 18,000 plus were in there. It was the loudest that I've heard that the Yum Center in quite a while. And I truly do think that the Louisville players were a little bit nervous because last year, the guys that were on the team, they didn't ever play in front of a full crowd. The freshmen on the team out of high school, they've obviously never played in front of a crowd that big. I really do think that some nerves played a factor in that slow start, as that environment on Saturday was one of the best that you'll find in all of college basketball.
Ty, let's talk a little bit about the school's leadership and the athletic department for a moment. From the outside looking in, there appears to be a need to get things settled down, maybe clean up some dysfunction. Can you reflect on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so obviously the Tom Jurich era came to a close pretty much in a way that was not a clean break. There's a lot of Jurich loyalists out there that have chosen to side with him versus U of L. Fast forward, they threw in a new board of trustees. They appointed a new athletic director, and then they hired a president. And neither of those two people are in power anymore. The athletic director is no longer U of L, and the president accepted a job at Penn State in the same capacity. So here we are with a interim AD and an interim president, just 4 years after Tom Jurich was abruptly let go from his position. You're right. There definitely needs to be some stability. From what I've heard, the board of trustees is back in a good place. There's a couple appointees or trustees on the board that had been kicked off but are now back on the board. The interim athletic director, Josh Hurd, is doing a great job from everything that I've been told. And then the presidential search, from what I've gathered, could take up to 18 months. So I would guess that you would see a permanent athletic director in place before the president. But you're right, stability definitely is lacking there on Floyd Street. And this basketball search, that's an interesting twist, is that for right now, an interim athletic director is going to be making that hire. So that's something to keep an eye on moving forward.
So you've made my my move into the Tom Jurich rumor so much easier here. I have been seeing this pop up a lot lately, and within the last 24 hours, especially, some thoughts. I mean, is that a possibility, a likelihood, or is?
So like I said earlier, there's a group of I don't know if they're fans now, but they're Jurich loyalists. So they put their loyalty to Tom Jurich over their loyalty to the school and the university. And that group over the last couple months has gotten really loud. And there's a handful of Louisville's biggest individual donors that distanced themselves from the school when Tom Jurich left. Those individuals are making a strong push towards the university, towards the board of trustees on behalf of Tom, citing that if Tom were to be brought back in, their checkbooks would be open again. And from a very close friend of Tom that I can vouch, put a message out there on Twitter today. That message is legitimate. That is a close friend of Tom Jurich's. So I think Tom Jurich would be open to returning to Louisville. But at the end of the day, the board of trustees and the president's office has to sign off on that. And I don't know if it even gets to that point. But if it does, I have a hard time seeing the Board of Trustees and the president's office giving that their seal of approval.
This is going to be fun to watch from the outside. So maybe we'll be touching base with you again before long just to see what happens. Let's move over into football. Let's talk a little bit about Scott Satterfield and the program. A little upset there over the years that I guess some of that dust has settled. Give us your thoughts on where the program is and Satterfield in the eyes of fans. Is he one of the guys, or is he still kind of on the outs?
That's a great question. So Satterfield's third year at Louisville, his first year, he won big. He won 8 games. He won the Music City Bowl. His second year, they took a major step back. Whether you want to blame that on COVID, that's up for debate. And then his third year, which was this past year, it was really an up and down year, but mostly it was on the down. And what really sent fans into an uproar was when Louisville got housed by their rival Kentucky in the last game of the season. There was some talk all year. They lost some leads. They lost a 17-point lead to Virginia. They blew some games late in the fourth quarter that really had fans upset. And then the dust had settled a little bit. They won 2 straight. They beat Duke pretty handily. They beat Syracuse pretty handily. So things kind of settled back down. And then Kentucky came into Louisville and just absolutely took it to the Cardinals and pretty much embarrassed Louisville. And that just threw gas on a fire that was pretty much stoked out. And there was a couple weeks where there was some uncertainty whether Scott Satterfield would be back or not. While this was going on, the athletic director and the president both left the school. So the winner in all of that, right or wrong, was Scott Satterfield, who's going to make a big time decision like that when there's no AD or president. So there was a week span where there's board meetings, athletic association meetings. It was a crazy time to cover Louisville. So fast forward to where we are right now. Scott Satterfield obviously kept his job. And a lot of fans, I'd say it's probably 50-50 as fans who wanted them to stay versus wanted them to go. But this offseason, Scott Satterfield has batted 1,000. Every move he's made has just been welcomed with open arms by the fan base. He went out and hired a new offensive coordinator in Lance Taylor from Notre Dame, a great up-and-coming offensive mind who coached running backs at Notre Dame. He coached running backs at Stanford, also coached wide receivers in the NFL at the Panthers. So Satterfield brought him in. Satterfield also brought in a Super Bowl MVP, Deion Branch, who was a star at Louisville as a player development role. That really excited fans. He also brought in Wesley McGriff from Florida as the co-defensive coordinator to help out Brian Brown on that end. And then the recruiting has really taken off. They just landed a 4-star top 150 kid in the country, Pierce Clarkson out of California for 2023. So Satterfield has really bought himself some insurance this offseason. I think there's still a portion of the fan base that wants to see this translate on the field into wins. But right now, Satterfield is back into the good graces of the Louisville fan base.
All right, so you mentioned they have a new offensive coordinator who's been a running back coach, and Louisville had some really strong contributions from Jalen Mitchell and Travion Cooley as freshmen last year. Could we see more of them in the running game? And on that same token, could you see a little less running from Malik Cunningham in 2022?
Yeah, so the staple of Scott Satterfield's offense is the outside run, the outside zone, the stretch. That's what he loves to do. That's his bread and butter. That's been the way since he's been in App State. He's a run-first coach. So Lance Taylor coming in, I think he's going to enhance and maybe adjust a little bit, but I think the offense for the most part is going to look a lot like it did last year, going to be a run-first offense. And you're right, their backfield is deep and talented. You mentioned those two guys, and they also brought in Tyon Evans from Tennessee, who's a really, really good running back, more of a speed back. So they do have 3 to 4 guys that they can really count on in the backfield. But at the end of the day, Malik Cunningham, part of what makes him so good is his legs. So I could see them maybe going away from the design runs. Their go-to on the goal line was the read option. And Malik Cunningham got stuffed against Clemson, where Louisville had goal to go to win the game and couldn't get in. They got stuffed against Air Force on the goal line trying to run it in with Cunningham. So I think situationally they could go away from the design quarterback run, but I do think you're still going to have Malik Cunningham scrambling, very much a part of this offense moving forward.
And skill positions in general are pretty strong for Louisville. We've talked, Cunningham's back. We just talked about the backfield, but the receivers, pretty much everyone that caught a pass for the most part will be back. But what about the offensive line? That's going to be a key question mark for the Cardinals this year.
Yeah. So the skill position, Louisville lost a pair of receivers to the portal. Jordan Watkins went to Ole Miss, and Justin Marshall went to Buffalo. But you're right, they do get their leading receiver back, and Marshawn Ford. He'll line up inside, he'll line up outside, he'll line up in the backfield. He's back, so Louisville does have that production returning. And then up front, the offensive line. The only guy they're losing is center Cole Bentley. He'll be off to the NFL. I'm not sure if he's projected to get drafted or not, but they do return Caleb Chandler, who was a first-team All-ACC selection last year. He'll play guard. They return Brian Hudson, who transferred in from Virginia Tech. He'll probably slide over to center. Adonis Boone's been a multiple-year starter for them. Renato Brown's been a multiple-year starter, and Trevor Reed has also been a multiple-year starter. So on paper, this Louisville team returns a lot up front, a lot in the backfield. They return their quarterback. So like I said earlier, I think a lot of the fans want to see some wins this year, because 6 wins last year was not good enough for the majority of the fan base.
So the defense, I don't think it's out too far fetched to say that they let the team down at points during the season. What have they done to address some of those defensive issues?
You're 100% right. The defense, what was not good for large parts of last season, especially in the fourth quarter. A couple key things for the Louisville defense. Arguably their 2 best defensive players, cornerback Keitrell Clark, who was an All-ACC performer 2 years ago. He tore his ACL and missed the most part of last year. And so did inside linebacker Monty Montgomery. Both of those guys missed the majority of last season. Both of those guys are on track to be back for spring practice, and that will be a big boost to the Louisville defense. As far as additions, they brought in a couple of transfers. They brought in Ole Miss linebacker Momo Sanogo, who racked up over 100 tackles at Ole Miss. He's a guy that's played a lot of college football at a high level, so they brought him in at linebacker. They also brought in a safety, MJ Griffin from Temple, out of the transfer portal. All indications are that he's going to be a day 1 starter at Louisville. And then, like I said earlier, they do return Keitrell Clark at corner, Monty Montgomery at linebacker, and they return Yasir Abdullah as well. He's a guy that had 10-plus sacks a year ago. So he'll be a big contributor returning. They also returned Kendrick Duncan at safety. He started every game last year. So I think the Louisville defense, I think, obviously where they were, it's not hard to improve off of that. But I think with what they have coming back, I think they have a chance to be a lot better than they were a year ago.
And also that came out just before we recorded is the schedule for the 2022 season. And it opens up with 4 of the first 6 games on the road. At Syracuse to open, at UCF. They also have Florida State and USF at home before going to BC and Virginia before the bye. It feels like that it's really important for this team it's a very manageable schedule, I'll say, but I think it's very important for Louisville to get off to a fast start, especially if they want to save Scott Satterfield's job.
That's impressive that you say that from an outsider's perspective, because everyone around here is saying Scott Satterfield starting off 2-0 will do wonders for him. And obviously that's a blanket statement that can be applied to any coach. But really, really, when you dive into Louisville, their first 2 games are on the road. If they split those games at 1-1, their home opener, I would be worried about the attendance for that game. I really do think starting 2-0, beating Syracuse and beating UCF will have this fan base re-energized. It will give them a sense of urgency to get out and support the team. There was a lot of animosity towards Satterfield, as we discussed earlier. So starting off 2-0 will do him and the staff wonders to get the fan base back on their side and in Cardinal Stadium to give them a nice home field advantage.
Interesting. I almost could say here Scott is on a little bit of a hot seat, but not quite. Depends on how he performs right up front from what I'm getting from what you're saying there. Hey, let's wrap with women's basketball, which has been on a roll. We were talking about this before we started recording the program. Walz has done a fabulous job with the Louisville women's basketball team. They have seemingly come out of nowhere, been a giant slayer, have basically taken it to Notre Dame. Now they're battling it out with NC State for domination in the ACC. Talk to us a little bit about this team. And I want to say this for the record, because we talked about this before. And the whole reason this question came up is because we got response from somebody on Reddit talking about how hot this team is. And I thought, you're right. If we've got Ty on, let's talk about just how good this team is and Jeff Walz.
Yeah. So what's honestly been impressive is that Louisville has been able to hold Jeff Walz in place through multiple athletic directors, multiple presidents. There's been some big-time programs that have come after Jeff Walz, but through it all, he's been a staple in this athletic program that's really just provided a program that in the women's team that's won a bunch of games and done things the right way, which that really hasn't been the case at Louisville very often. With the men's basketball program over the last several years. So Jeff Walz and the women's program has really, really picked up a lot of supporters. There's a lot of their home games this year that have gotten more fans than the men's, to be quite frank. This year is no different. They're 18-2. They were on a 16-game win streak up until the top 5 showdown with NC State. Louisville had NC State down late into that game and then collapsed in the fourth quarter. Louisville looked like the better team by and large for 80% of that game and really let it slip away towards the end. But they're 18-2 right now. They just beat Duke last night, 77-65. Haley Van Leith, their leading scorer on the season, poured in 17. She's averaging right around 12 points a game. She's a big-time player that played a lot as a true freshman last year. She's back for Louisville and has really been what they need from the guard position. And then Walz, like most other places, he's utilized the transfer portal to his advantage. He's brought in multiple impact transfers, notably Emily Inksler, who's averaging 11 points on the season. So Walz has really, really got things going on. And he's established a culture there where it's built for long-term success. It's not a program that's going to win a bunch of games in 1 year then be in for a rebuild. He's built this roster. He's built this program. He's gotten it to a place where you expect them to be good every year. So really hats off to Jeff Walz. He's doing a great job. He's really providing some positivity for U of L. He's been a voice of reason during turmoil and during scandals around the university. He's really been a positive light. So really glad you mentioned the women's program. They deserve a ton of credit. Jeff Walz deserves a lot of that as well.
For those of you who don't or have not watched ACC women's basketball, it's some of the best basketball in the nation, college-wise. It's fun to watch. And if you're into brackets, ESPN's Charlie Cream has his bracket out, and Louisville is the number 1 seed for the tournament. So that's some positive news. We'll watch and see what happens. I'm looking forward to how they do in the tournament. Our special guest, the publisher of CardinalSports.com, Ty Spalding. And hey, Ty, before we let you go, when we have somebody on for the first time, which is the case, we like to find out what their favorite food is, and maybe a favorite restaurant as well. So we're going to delve into your culinary choices here a little bit, put you on the spot and see if you have a favorite food and a favorite restaurant.
Absolutely. So if you all do get a chance to swing by Louisville, whether it be a football game or a basketball game at the Yum Center or another event, a couple places to recommend. If you're looking to get the most out of your money, I recommend Jay Alexander's. It's I would say it's a upper end, but still casual in a way. It's a steakhouse in Louisville. Filet is my favorite item there. You can't go wrong with Jay Alexander's in Louisville. It's a great place if you want to get a bite to eat. And then the restaurant for special occasions, if you're in Louisville, maybe for one time, the Jeff Ruby's in Louisville is top notch. It's right down there by the Yum Center. If you do come in for a basketball game, highly recommend working that into your schedule. So if you're sensing a theme here, my favorite food is definitely a nice filet. Obviously, that's something that those two places are definitely not the norm for me, but if I were to have my meal of choice, it would definitely be a nice filet.
Don't think you're going to have an argument from either Will or I on that point. Nope. Hey, thanks for joining us, Ty.
Absolutely, guys. Thanks for having me on. Louisville tends to be a place that can't stay out of the news. So if you all have any other questions or want any clarity on anything, feel free to reach out and I'll be glad to help.